what scale of sanctions do you expect today? And do you see them as being staged? Stage one set of sanctions today to see whether there begins an off-ramp and perhaps an evolution of those sanctions.
Yes, absolutely. I think the West has planned it, very well. Both the United States and the European Union are looking at escalating sanctions gradually and keeping the sanctions leverage to deter, to raise the cost for President Putin with further escalation. So far, of course, we have not seen.
Well, what is a painful sanction, Oksana? The one thing that I am struggling with is to understand what a real penal sanction would be on Russia to get Putin to stop. Define that for me.
Well, I think it depends who you are in Russia. If you are a private Russian company, listed on London Stock Exchange, if you're a Russian exporter, integrated in the global markets, I think the sanctions that we will see today will be extremely painful. We're already seeing Russian stock market tumbling, ruble, appreciating, the Russian debt is becoming more costly, and Russian companies will be cut off and will not be able to borrow in international markets. If you're President Putin, you have a different kind of calculation. He said very clearly that he doesn't see any sanctions as a threat to Russia. He accumulated 600 billion of reserves. He sees the sanctions giving him rallying around the flag effect. And he thinks that he also has leverage. He threatened potentially to cut off energy supplies to Europe. He certainly can introduce, capital controls. He can, seize, Western assets within Russia. He can do many things from his side. So if he's President Putin, he is not afraid of any sanctions.
Well, he's not afraid, and that certainly comes across very, very clearly in terms of these actions. Yesterday morning we were talking about a potential détente and talks, and here we are at a quasi-full escalation. You talk about him not being afraid. The US, the UK, Europe together, how united are they in your view?
Well, they certainly are much more united than they've been in 2014 during the illegal annexation of Crimea and the first war in Donbass. So they put forward a very clear political unity. The question is now when the sanctions would have to be applied. And of course, the cost of sanctions are going to be distributed unevenly. The Europeans in particular would have to pay a much higher price for those sanctions. Whether they will decide to impose particularly, I would say, there's a question mark over any sanctions in the energy sector because Europe is very vulnerable here. So I do not foresee Europeans going for any energy sanctions. Even the Nord Stream 2 at the moment, given the kind of a limited scale of Russian action in Ukraine, perhaps something which is not going to be taken entirely off the table. At the same time, Europeans and Americans are united in talking about financial sanctions, cutting Russia off the financial markets, targeting Russian banks. So I expect that very much to be unified action. And of course, targeted individual sanctions.
Oksana, isn't this the whole point, though? Isn't this the whole point, though? And I am not well enough qualified to define the risk parameters around this, but you may be, which is Europe, the US, etc., fear the weaponization of oil and gas. We've already seen the pain in the gas market and the energy markets, but the jugular with Russia is the 7 million barrels of oil that they export. Where does the US, UK, and Europe need to strike in sanctions to really bear down on Vladimir Putin and stop?
I think in the short run, my view has always been that the threat of sanctions, any sanctions, will not deter Putin from doing what he wants to do, because he, as we just discussed, doesn't feel that sanctions are against his, interest staying in power. However, I think sanctions are an important signal, that the West stands with Ukraine, and it is a long game. Sanctions are always long game. It is something which is going to cut off Russia from international markets. And over time, it will certainly penalize and undermine Russia's capacity to grow. But in the short term, just the threat of any sanctions, and of course, you're totally right, Europe cannot threaten, to cut itself off Russian gas in particular. I think oil
of course not.
is perhaps less so, but gas, it's dependent on Russian gas overwhelmingly.